My name is Pete Bucher, and I serve as the OEC Action Fund Program Director. Just as we're working with partners to protect Ohio's parks and forests, we've also been working with partners to protect Ohio's water from source to tap. First, let's look back. One of the biggest battles of the last 6 months for our water team has been the fight against Ohio's dirty water bill. House Bill 175, despite our best advocacy efforts, moved forward and was signed into law in late April. This bill removes ephemeral streams, also known as seasonal or rain-dependent streams, from what is defined as a water of the state in Ohio. Ultimately protected by the Ohio EPA and governing what they can regulate. Unless the Biden administration updates the federal equivalent to waters of the United States, Ohio will remain without solid protections for over 36,000 miles of streams in our state. In better news, we've been tracking House Bill 365, which seeks to put in place limits on PFAS, also known as forever chemicals, in drinking water and surface water to better protect Ohioans. We've also seen federal government action setting more protective health advisory levels for PFAS, in addition to making investments to help states address PFAS pollution. One of the most significant victories we've seen for water recently in the investments in the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Last November, Congress passed the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act after decades of funding underinvestment from the federal government for our water infrastructure. And what does this mean for Ohio? According to the American Society of Civil Engineers, Ohio has an estimated $27 billion in need over the next 20 years to fully update our state's water infrastructure. From the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act, Ohio will see approximately $1.6 billion for water infrastructure investments, including funding for replacing lead water service lines, addressing emerging contaminants like PFAS pollution. All or most of this funding will be funneling through two communities and water utilities to the Ohio EPA's Drinking Water and Wastewater Revolving Loan Fund. Half of the funding will be available as interest-free grants for qualified disadvantaged communities over the next 5 years, beginning in 2022. This infrastructure funding bill is going to be a great first step towards addressing Ohio's backlog of water infrastructure needs, but we're going to need a lot more resources to fully get ahead of our problems. Also in the spring, President Biden visited the city of Lorain, Ohio, along the shores of Lake Erie to announce an additional $1 billion for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. The GLRI is managed by the US EPA, and it's one of the most important tools across our region to protect for clean water against toxic algae. It also helps eliminate invasive species and restore habitat. This agency will use the bulk of the $1 billion investment to clean up and restore several degraded sites known as areas of concern. This will also allow for major acceleration of progress that will deliver significant environmental impact, economic, health, and recreational benefits to communities throughout the Great Lakes region. To speak more about the impact of this federal legislation on local communities, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Nick Mandros.
Thank you, Pete. My name is Nick Mandros, and I serve as our Northwest Ohio Regional Director. Over the past few years, I've had the pleasure of working alongside frontline partners like the Junction Coalition and the United Pastors for Social Empowerment to develop a new local legislation that can serve as a model for other communities so that every resident in Ohio, whether you live in a city, small village, or rural township, has access to clean, safe, and affordable drinking water. Currently, Ohio is ranked second in the nation for the number of lead water lines that deliver our tap water. According to research done by NRDC, there are over 650,000 lead lines in our state alone. That's one lead line for every 18 Ohioans. Unfortunately, the prevalence of these poisonous pipes is disproportionately higher in Ohio's legacy cities like Toledo, Cleveland, or Lorain, and most significantly in minority neighborhoods within those cities that fall within historic homeowners loan corporation red line maps. As a homeowner already struggling to pay rising costs of all bills, the cost to fully replace these lead lines can be expensive, anywhere from $2,000 to $7,000. Well, thanks to strong advocacy by partners and local advocates on how federal infrastructure dollars are spent at the local level, last year, the cities of Toledo and Cincinnati approved plans to fully replace all customer-owned lead service lines covering the full cost of replacement for the city residents and protecting future generations from the threat of lead in their drinking water. We were excited to welcome the US EPA Administrator Michael Regan and Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur to Toledo to highlight these investments just earlier this year. It's our goal at OEC to secure additional investments in water infrastructure to entirely cover this replacement cost for every homeowner in the state of Ohio.
Thanks, Nick. As we look forward to the next 6 months, there's certainly more to be done at the federal level, advocating for increased and continued water infrastructure investments proportional to Ohio's water infrastructure needs. At the state level, we'll be tracking water quality concerns, especially as this time of year, we typically see toxic algal blooms in waterways across the state. Algal blooms are large concentrations of algae that can produce toxins like microcystin, which causes skin rashes, gastrointestinal problems, and varying degrees of nervous system, liver, and kidney damage when you come in contact with it. At the end of June, we'll be turning into the annual Lake Erie harmful algal bloom forecast, where researchers will estimate the severity of this year's toxic algal bloom coming up. We'll continue to monitor and follow the weekly bloom reports throughout the summer and call on state lawmakers for additional permanent investments in water quality improvements. One major state program that is tackling Ohio's toxic algal problems is H2 Ohio. Last year, state lawmakers approved major investments for the program, including funding to reduce nutrient loading through farming best practices, wetland creation projects, and other infrastructure improvements. But this funding only lasts for about another 12 months. The OEC Action Fund and our partners believe that a long-term funding will be needed for these H2 Ohio projects so they can achieve the water quality results they're aiming for. One long-term option that we are exploring is a 10-year water bond to lock in a decade of improvement projects so all Ohioans can have safe, clean, and affordable water into the future.